Donald Trump is once again threatening to beat the crap out of Iran today after Iran carried out an attack on Jordan. The fragile truce between the US and Iran is once again at risk of falling apart. On the evening of July 28, for the first time since Donald Trump announced a pause in strikes, Iran launched several ballistic missiles at a US military base in Jordan. The US Central Command stated that all the missiles were intercepted and there were no casualties. But Trump has already blown up and said that if the Iranians don't make a deal with him this time, then he is definitely ready to start a total war. Spoiler, Trump has made such threats more than once, but there has never been an escalation. But the significance of the event is that this is the first missile attack by Iran on an American military base since Trump stopped the military campaign, as he put it, to give diplomacy another chance. And it happened just a few hours after his meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House. In general, in this episode, we will break down exactly what happened, what both sides are saying, and what the likely scenarios for further developments are. My name is Pechiy. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this YouTube channel, like this episode, and leave any comment under this video. So, let's start with an exact chronology because it's important not to confuse two different episodes of this war. Both are connected to Iran's strike on Jordan, but today Trump mixed everything up a bit and started, for example, attributing to the current strike the casualties among American servicemen that actually happened a bit earlier. Back on July 18, Iran struck the Muwafaq Salti airbase in Jordan. As a result, 2 American servicemen were killed. These were the first US combat losses in this war in several months and pushed Trump to launch a 13-day airstrike campaign against Iran. Well, more precisely, to intensify these strikes, and it was at that moment, while commenting on the deaths of the servicemen, Trump said that he absolutely did not care about Iran's statement on withdrawing from the Memorandum of Understanding signed in June, and that this time, the United States of America will definitely destroy Iran. But 13 days of mutual attacks passed, and on Friday, July 24, Trump himself announced that there would be a pause in the bombings, supposedly because the Iranians once again asked for talks with him. Well, according to Trump's rhetoric, they were practically begging him to stop, saying, "Please, let's sit down at the negotiating table." The Iranians, of course, denied this. As a result, on the evening of July 28, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps launched several ballistic missiles at the American military base in Jordan. The United States Central Command, in an official statement, reports, quote, "All Iranian missiles were successfully intercepted. US forces remain vigilant and at a high level of readiness." This time, according to available data, there were no casualties and no more than 4 ballistic missiles were launched. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps openly acknowledged that it was they who carried out the attack. And this morning, July 29, Donald Trump sternly promised, quote, to knock the crap out of Iran after the attack on American troops in Jordan. Here is his quote, "Sham Shakiri Wondin. We will beat the living hell out of them. We will hit them hard. They will get a good beating." But let's be honest. Donald Trump has already used almost identical rhetoric and profanity toward Iran during previous escalations this year. And as a rule, all these threats usually came to almost nothing. Let me remind you of just a couple of such telling quotes from Trump. On June 11, a week before the signing of the failed, by the way, truce, Trump stated, quote, "If Iran does not accept the US conditions to end the war, we will beat the crap out of them tonight." They didn't. In early July, Trump repeated, quote, "We beat the hell out of Iran. Now they desperately want to make a deal." As it turned out, they don't. After that, let me remind you, Iran broke the truce and 13 days of mutual bombings began. On July 29, Trump once again threatens to beat the crap out of Iran. And even earlier in April, that's actually the second month of the war there. In April, when Iran completely blocked the Strait of Hormuz for the first time, Trump said, quote, "Open the damn strait, you crazy bastards, or you'll live in hell." But all these threats turned out to be just empty words. It's already been 5 months, by the way. Yesterday marked exactly 5 months of the US war against Iran. The Strait of Hormuz is closed, the nuclear program remains. None of the issues that were raised at the beginning of the war have been resolved, but Donald Trump's war goals have not been achieved, and now, after 5 months, he is once again making fierce statements that he will beat all the crap out of Iran. But the significance of Iran's current attack is also that it happened just a few hours after Trump's meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House. This was their first in-person meeting since they jointly launched the military operation against Iran on February 28. By the way, in the comments on the previous episode about the meeting between Trump and Netanyahu, a lot of Israelis showed up, and to be honest, they really unpleasantly surprised me. You really shocked me. Honestly, you attack everyone indiscriminately, using the word anti-Semitism completely out of place. You accuse absolutely everyone of anti-Semitism. As far as I understand, you don't care at all. If someone's opinion even slightly differs from yours, and you haven't even finished listening to the episode, you immediately start throwing insults, with accusations, with threats. And this is after I revealed basically what seemed to be information that was already public about the conflict between Trump and Netanyahu. When I said that this was the first meeting in 5 months of war, there were a huge number of Israelis who started sending me all kinds of curse-filled messages, claiming that this is a lie. How many times they talked on the phone, man? Don't you get it? They had as many as 8 in-person meetings during Trump's second presidential term. And how does all this cancel out the fact that for 5 months of the war they actually didn't meet in person? How does that cancel out this fact? Generally, the Israelis, you really shocked me. Honestly, I admit I was shocked yesterday. But let's get back to the topic. A day before that, on July 27, Trump stated that the US would engage in very serious negotiations with Iran, but warned that he would resume very harsh military action if diplomacy does not yield results. When asked how much time he was willing to give the negotiations, Trump answered briefly, quote, "Not much time, it will either be quick or not at all." And at the same time, the US and Saudi Arabia carried out joint but separate strikes, but this time on a different target. Al Jazeera reports that on Wednesday, American and Saudi military forces carried out airstrikes against pro-Iranian groups in eastern Iraq. In response to a series of more than 30 drone attacks by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps on Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure. As a result of these strikes across 7 Iraqi provinces, at least 20 people were killed, and 32 pro-Iranian militia fighters were wounded. The spokesperson for the Saudi Arabian Ministry of Defense, Major General Turki al-Maliki, stated that the attacks on oil facilities were carried out by Iran-backed armed groups, specifically from Iraqi territory, as well as by Yemeni Houthis. In general, it is already clear that Iran is focusing its efforts on attacking Saudi Arabia from the territories of Iraq and Yemen. Thus, as of July 29th, the situation looks approximately like this. Iran attacked an American base in Jordan. The US and Saudi Arabia struck pro-Iranian forces in Iraq in response to attacks on Saudi oil infrastructure. And at the same time, the last diplomatic initiative on the main contentious issue collapsed. That's the status of the Hormuz Strait, and that's what we'll talk about next. There is less and less hope for resolving the situation in the Hormuz Strait. We're talking about Oman's proposal. According to Reuters, Oman presented Iran with a plan to create a joint regional mechanism for managing the Hormuz Strait, modeled after the system used to control the Malacca Strait, where, let me remind you, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore jointly administer transit through this strait based on voluntary contributions from ship owners. Iran rejected this proposal and stated that the strait belongs to it, and that it alone will decide who and how can pass through it. Now, the Deputy Foreign Minister of Iran, Kazem Garibabadi, states that the scheme of equal distribution of control with Oman does not serve Iran's interests. In other words, everything should go to Iran, or not at all, and they absolutely don't care that Oman, if you follow this logic, has the same claims to the Strait of Hormuz as Iran does. As a result, the Iranian Foreign Ministry stated that the strait remains closed. At the same time, the position of the United States is a categorical rejection of any duties or fees for transit. So, the scheme proposed by Oman and Iran with voluntary contributions basically still contradicts what Washington is trying to achieve. By the way, Iran is getting bolder and bolder. The New York Times writes that Iran did in fact consider striking Ukraine. According to the publication, after the attack on its merchant ship in the Caspian Sea on July 25, Tehran considered the possibility of launching a missile strike on one of Ukraine's seaports. The New York Times sources claim that the expected strike would have been symbolic. That is, a missile with a small warhead, intended more to signal a response, but to cause relatively minor damage. And according to the publication, these plans have currently been postponed thanks to diplomatic efforts. Let me remind you that on July 25, Ukrainian forces struck an Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea. At that time, one sailor was killed and another was wounded. But that's what happens when you mess around, because that vessel was clearly transporting military goods to filthy Russia. Iran's foreign ministry called this a violation of the UN Charter and an attempt to drag Europe into the conflict between the US and Iran. Supposedly, this strike was carried out on Israel's orders. Well, that's just all this Iranian nonsense. And after that, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi had a phone conversation with Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andriy Sybiha, who, according to Araghchi, allegedly described this attack as unintentional. He says, well, they hit by accident. And the New York Times also notes that after the US blocked Iran's ports in the Persian Gulf, the Caspian Sea has become an even more important trade route for Tehran's trade with filthy Russia, both official and shadow trade, and it was precisely that shadow trade that Ukraine targeted. Another front of escalation in the Middle East is the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. The Iran-backed Yemeni Houthi movement Ansar Allah, which declared a naval blockade of Saudi Arabia, is considering introducing a fee for commercial ships passing through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, with the only exception being for Chinese vessels. So, in other words, the Houthis, following their bosses in Tehran, will try to establish control over the Red Sea. And if they succeed, they will try to charge ships just like Iran wants to do in the Strait of Hormuz. Basically, Iran and its proxy forces are trying to take full control of two straits in the region at once, the Bab el-Mandeb and the Hormuz Strait, the Hormuz Strait. And Trump can't do anything about it for now. The economic impact of all these events combined is already noticeable on the oil market, against the backdrop of US and Saudi Arabia strikes on targets in Iraq and the interception of Iranian ballistic missiles. Brent crude oil futures rose by $3.15 on Wednesday, or almost 4%, to $87 per barrel. This is a continuation of a broader trend because weeks earlier, amid Houthi threats, Brent exceeded the $100 per barrel mark for the first time in 2 months. And now analysts are warning that if the Houthis' threats are fully realized, that is, if both key straits, the Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb, end up being blocked at the same time, then global oil prices could actually jump to $200 per barrel. Now let's talk about who doesn't benefit from the current escalation and who, on the contrary, stands to benefit. For the United States, the continuation of the escalation is politically inconvenient. The rise in gasoline prices hits voters right before the congressional midterm elections. And according to several sources, the military departments had previously warned about the critical depletion of air defense interceptor stocks after 13 nights of strikes in July. That's why Donald Trump suspended the bombing campaign on July 24. That's why the attack on Jordan on July 28 puts him in a difficult position between saving face and returning to a costly military operation. Saudi Arabia. Escalation is also not beneficial for Saudi Arabia. Attacks on its oil infrastructure hit its own export revenues. That's why Riyadh has openly joined the strikes against pro-Iranian forces in Iraq, trying to stop the threat right at its root. For Iran, on the other hand, maintaining the status quo in the Hormuz Strait, meaning actual control over the strait, is strategically beneficial, since this is its main leverage. At the same time, further escalation with the Americans carries direct military risks for Tehran, which explains why the plan to strike the Ukrainian port was postponed and not carried out. Direct military risks, which explains why the plan to strike the Ukrainian port was postponed and not carried out. Ukraine, in this configuration, turned out to be, I would say, an accidental party to the conflict. Because the episode in the Caspian Sea shows that Kyiv's actions against Iranian-Russian logistics create an additional, separate from the main one, risk of escalation. Well, all of this is also beneficial to China. After all, it received an exemption from both Iran and Yemen's Houthis. So as they say, it ended up above the fray, and I don't think it was for free. I'll have a separate episode about this. What's next? The first scenario is the resumption of a full-scale US strike campaign against Iran if Trump considers the attack on the base in Jordan sufficient grounds and decides that dialogue has run its course. Well, Trump's rhetoric after this incident points in this direction, though statements like, "we'll beat the crap out of Iran," have been made before. And the second scenario is maintaining the current format of limited escalation. That is, limited tit-for-tat strikes against pro-Iranian proxies and facilities in third countries, for example in Iraq and Yemen, without directly resuming massive bombings of Iran itself while continuing negotiations through Oman. And then there's the third scenario, further spread of the conflict to maritime routes. If the Houthis carry out their threat to charge for passage through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait or close it entirely, simultaneously with the ongoing blockade of the Hormuz Strait. And all this will create a double energy shock, which analysts are warning about. Well, now a lot depends on what Donald Trump decides, who is once again making threats, which are by now seen as just cheap talk, which hardly works to intimidate anyone anymore. Well, I don't think anyone is scared by Trump's statements that we'll beat the hell out of Iran. Who is that supposed to scare? Explain it to me. In summary, on the evening of July 28, Iran, for the first time since the pause announced by the US, attacked an American military base in Jordan with ballistic missiles. All of them were intercepted. At the same time, the US and Saudi Arabia struck pro-Iranian groups in Iraq. Iran rejected Oman's compromise proposal for joint management of the Hormuz Strait. Well, the Houthis are considering introducing a fee for passage through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Oil prices are rising amid all these events. Trump has publicly stated that he is ready to return to military action if the negotiations do not yield quick results. And we've been hearing this nonsense for 5 months already. Well, it looks like a big war is simply inevitable. Either that or Trump will have to back down. But Trump, as they say, might change his mind again. Who knows at this point? I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like this video. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, I would be grateful to you for that. You can do this by donating through the links and details in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone!